The rain had turned the streets of London into a glistening maze of light and shadow, reflections of neon signs shimmering on the wet pavement. A lone violinist stood beneath an awning, her delicate fingers coaxing a haunting melody from her instrument. Pedestrians bustled past, some tossing loose change into her open case. Then came the voice, harsh, dismissive, and dripping with arrogance. "That's the worst attempt at music I've ever heard." The violinist froze, her deep brown eyes meeting the sneer of a man in a tailored Armani suit. He chuckled, shaking his head. What he didn't know, what no one knew, was that the woman he just insulted was no ordinary street performer. She was a princess. Hi everyone. Welcome back to Ever After Stories. Today, I have a heartfelt story to share with you. Get ready to feel all the emotions. Sebastian Langley rarely thought twice about the people he insulted. He moved through life like a man untouchable, never lingering on the faces of those beneath his notice. But that night, as he sat in the back of his chauffeured Rolls-Royce, sipping a glass of Macallan 25, his mind drifted back to the violinist. Something about her unsettled him. It wasn't just her defiance, it was her presence. Most street performers were eager for attention, desperate for a few coins. But Isla had stood her ground as if she belonged to a different world. "Forget her," he muttered, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off an invisible weight. Yet, the next morning, as he scrolled through the financial reports in his penthouse suite overlooking the Thames, an email from his assistant, Evelyn, caught his attention. Subject: Urgent, upcoming royal summit in London. Sebastian opened it with mild disinterest until a name leaped off the screen: Princess Isla Al-Masri of Akron. His breath hitched. No, it couldn't be. He clicked on the attachment, and there, staring back at him, was a photo of the very same woman he had insulted the night before. The violinist. The street performer. Only now, she wasn't wrapped in a tattered shawl. She wore an elegant silk gown, a sapphire necklace resting against her collarbone. The same unshakable confidence in her eyes. Sebastian exhaled slowly, realization sinking in. Isla wasn't just some musician struggling for change. She was the daughter of King Zafar of Akron, one of the wealthiest and most influential monarchs in the world. And he had mocked her. His mind reeled, but his instincts took over. He had spent years turning mistakes into opportunities, and this was no different. Sebastian reached for his phone and dialed Evelyn. "Get me into that summit," he said. "Sir? I want an invitation." "Find a way." Evelyn hesitated. "It's a private event. Only diplomats, royals, and select business leaders." "Then make me one of them." His voice was cold, sharp. "Akron is expanding its international trade sector. That means potential investments. Find the right contacts and make it happen." "Yes, Mr. Langley." Sebastian ended the call, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. This wasn't just about business anymore. It was about something more personal. He had underestimated Isla once. He wouldn't make that mistake again. The Royal Summit was held at Claridge's, the luxury Mayfair hotel that had hosted monarchs and dignitaries for over a century. That evening, Sebastian arrived in a perfectly tailored midnight blue tuxedo, his confidence restored. He was here not just as an investor, but as a player in a much larger game. The ballroom was a vision of wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over marble floors, champagne flowed in delicate flutes, and conversations swirled in a dozen languages. Diplomats, aristocrats, and billionaires mingled effortlessly, their status marked by the subtle ease with which they carried themselves. And then he saw her. Princess Isla stood near a grand piano, engaged in quiet conversation with an older gentleman in a military uniform. She was radiant, her deep red gown a stark contrast against her sun-kissed skin. The transformation from street performer to royalty should have been jarring, but it wasn't. It was as if both identities, violinist and princess, coexisted seamlessly. Sebastian adjusted his cufflinks and strode toward her. The older man took his leave just as Sebastian reached her side. Isla turned, her expression neutral but unreadable. "Princess," he said smoothly, offering a slight bow, careful to exude just the right balance of respect and confidence. "I believe we've met." Her lips curved ever so slightly. "Have we?" He let out a low chuckle. I suppose you wouldn't remember. It was just last night. A violinist in the rain. I remember, she said simply. Sebastian's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. He had expected her to dismiss him, to pretend as if the incident never happened. Instead, she acknowledged it without hesitation, placing the weight of their last encounters squarely between them. You play beautifully, he admitted. I regret my hasty judgment. She studied him for a long moment, as if deciding whether he was worth her time. Regret, Mr. Langley, is a luxury only afforded to those who can afford to make mistakes. Sebastian raised an eyebrow, intrigued. She was sharp, sharper than most of the people in his world, who fawned over him out of greed or fear. Isla, however, owed him nothing. I'd like to make it up to you, he said. Perhaps over dinner? She tilted her head, amusement flickering in her dark eyes. Are you asking a princess to dine with you as an apology? I prefer to think of it as an opportunity, he countered. For both of us. She smiled then, not out of warmth, but as if she were indulging a game she already knew how to win. And what makes you think I need an opportunity? Sebastian stepped closer, lowering his voice. Because you weren't playing for money last night. You were playing for something else. Something even a princess can't buy. For the first time, Isla's expression flickered, just slightly, but it was enough. Sebastian had found his opening. Before she could respond, a palace official approached and whispered something in her ear. Isla nodded, then turned back to Sebastian. Enjoy the summit, Mr. Langley. And with that, she walked away, leaving Sebastian standing in the middle of a room filled with power, yet knowing that, for the first time in years, he had just met someone who was entirely beyond his control. Sebastian Langley was not accustomed to being ignored. Yet, as he watched Princess Isla disappear into the sea of royals and dignitaries, he felt an unfamiliar sensation, one he rarely experienced. Intrigue. His business empire had been built on the ability to read people, to anticipate their desires and weaknesses. But Isla was unreadable, and that made her the most fascinating puzzle he had ever encountered. He turned on his heel, grabbing a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, and began moving through the ballroom with practiced ease. If Isla was a challenge, then he would rise to meet it. As the night wore on, Sebastian kept a careful distance, watching as Isla navigated the room. Every interaction she had was poised, deliberate. She laughed politely at an ambassador's joke, listened intently as an oil tycoon spoke of global markets, but there was something distant about her. She wasn't here out of choice. Sebastian recognized that look. It was the same one he had seen in the mirror before walking into boardrooms filled with men twice his age, waiting for him to fail. Isla was playing a role, just as he had done so many times before. It wasn't until much later in the evening that he found his next opportunity. The ballroom had begun to thin out as the more casual guests left for the night. Sebastian noticed Isla stepping out onto the balcony, a rare moment of solitude in an otherwise suffocating evening. Without hesitation, he followed. Outside, the cool London air carried the distant hum of the city below. Isla leaned against the ornate railing, gazing at the skyline. For the first time that evening, she looked human. Not a princess, not an untouchable figure of royalty, but a woman who had stolen a moment of quiet. Sebastian approached, stopping just beside her. You don't strike me as someone who enjoys these events, he said. She exhaled a soft laugh, shaking her head. That obvious? He shrugged, only to those who are paying attention. She glanced at him then, eyes searching. And why are you paying attention, Mr. Langley? He leaned against the railing, mirroring her posture. Because you don't belong here. Her brow arched. Excuse me? Not in the way they expect, he clarified. You wear the gown, you smile at the right moments, but your mind is somewhere else. Isla studied him for a long moment. And where do you think my mind is? Sebastian turned slightly, facing her. On the music. Her lips parted slightly, as if he had struck a nerve. He pressed on. You weren't just playing for fun last night. That was something more. And yet, here you are, dressed in silk, entertaining politicians and businessmen who will never understand what it means to create something for the sake of it. Isla looked away, gripping the railing a little tighter. For a moment, He thought she wouldn't answer. But then she spoke. "My father doesn't approve of my music," she said quietly. "He believes it's a hobby, something unbecoming of a future queen." Sebastian tilted his head. "You're next in line for the throne?" She nodded. "Akron is a small but powerful nation. My father has spent his life ensuring its stability, forging alliances. He believes my duty is to the people, not to frivolous passions." She let out a soft sigh. To him, music is a distraction. Sebastian studied her profile, the tension in her jaw, the flicker of longing in her gaze. He understood now. Isla wasn't just playing for herself. She was fighting for something. "I built my company from nothing," he said after a moment. "My father wanted me to take over his real estate empire, but I refused. I walked away, started my own path." Isla turned to him, intrigued. "And did it work?" A slow smirk crossed his lips. "You tell me." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "Yes, I suppose it did." There was a silence between them, but it was not uncomfortable. It was charged, filled with something unspoken. Finally, Sebastian straightened. "Come with me," he said. She frowned. "Where?" He extended a hand. "Somewhere you can be yourself." Isla hesitated. She had spent her life under the weight of duty, expectations pressing down on her shoulders. And yet, for the first time in a long while, someone had seen her, not as a princess, but as a person. And so, against her better judgment, she placed her hand in his. And let him lead her into the night. Isla had never felt the weight of her title more than she did that night. Every step she took away from the gilded ballroom felt like shedding a layer of expectation, like breathing for the first time. Sebastian led her through a private corridor, past security who didn't dare question a billionaire in a tailored tuxedo. Within moments, they emerged onto the quiet streets of Mayfair. The air was crisp, the city alive with the sounds of late-night revelers and distant taxi horns. She hesitated. "Are we really doing this?" Sebastian smirked. "You're a princess, Isla, not a prisoner. You can leave whenever you want." Her heart pounded as she glanced back toward Claridge's, where a world of formality and duty waited. Then she looked at Sebastian, the man who had insulted her, then intrigued her, and now, strangely, seemed to understand her. She exhaled. "All right, let's go." They walked through the city like two strangers in a world that didn't know them. For once, no one bowed, no one whispered Isla's name. London didn't care that she was royalty, and for the first time in her life, she loved that. Sebastian guided her to a hidden jazz club, a place he claimed even the wealthiest in the city didn't know about. Inside, the atmosphere was intoxicating, dim lighting, the scent of whiskey and old leather, the rich hum of a stand-up bass filling the air. "Do you come here often?" she asked as they slipped into a booth. "I own it," he admitted with a grin. She laughed, shaking her head. "Of course you do." A pianist played in the background, fingers dancing effortlessly over the keys. Isla's gaze softened, drawn in by the music. Sebastian watched her carefully. "Go on then." She turned to him, brow raised. "Go on what?" He gestured to the small stage where a battered violin rested against a chair. "Play." Isla hesitated. The thought of picking up an instrument here, among strangers, thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. Don't think, he interrupted. "Just do it." Her pulse quickened. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, she slid out of the booth and made her way to the stage. The club hushed as she lifted the violin, tucking it beneath her chin. For a moment, she closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of rosin and aged wood. Then she played. The first note was soft, uncertain. But as the melody poured from her fingers, confidence followed. She played not for duty, not for expectation, but for herself. The music was raw, filled with longing, with defiance, with the quiet ache of a woman caught between two worlds. Sebastian watched, entranced. He had seen power in boardrooms, in hostile takeovers, in the art of the deal. But this was power of a different kind. A power that needed no wealth, no status. When the last note faded into silence, the room erupted in applause. Isla lowered the violin, breathless, her cheeks flushed with exhilaration. As she returned to the table, Sebastian leaned forward, voice low. You belong up there. She shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. My father would disagree. Sebastian smirked. Then maybe it's time to stop letting him decide who you are. She met his gaze, and for the first time, the idea didn't seem so impossible. The night stretched on, a world apart from the one Isla had always known. The weight of duty, of expectations, faded into the background, replaced by something far more intoxicating, freedom. Sebastian and Isla left the jazz club just as the streets of London quieted. A hush had settled over the city, the kind that only existed in the early hours before dawn. They walked side by side, their footsteps the only sound against the cobblestone paths. Do you ever think about leaving? Sebastian asked suddenly. Isla glanced at him. Leaving what? The throne. The expectations, all of it. She hesitated. It was a question she had never allowed herself to truly consider. But now, standing beneath the glow of street lamps, with the echo of her violin still lingering in her mind, she allowed herself to be honest. Yes, she admitted. But it's not that simple. Sebastian smirked. Nothing worth having ever is. She studied him, taking in the sharp angles of his face, the confidence in his stance. He was a man who had built his empire from the ground up, who had turned his back on his own family's expectations to carve out his own path. And here he was, challenging her to do the same. A flicker of something dangerous and exhilarating passed between them, an unspoken invitation to break free. But reality had a way of creeping back in. A sleek black car pulled up beside them, and a man in a dark suit stepped out. Isla recognized him instantly, one of her father's security officers. Princess, the man said, his tone carefully measured. It's time to return. Sebastian's expression hardened. Looks like your father isn't a fan of late-night adventures. Isla let out a slow breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. The moment she stepped into that car, this night, this feeling of liberation, would end. She turned to Sebastian. Thank you, she said softly. For tonight. His jaw tensed as if he wanted to say more, to stop her. But instead he nodded. You'll figure it out, he said. One way or another. She held his gaze for a moment longer before slipping into the car. The door closed, sealing her back into the life she had tried to escape. As the car pulled away, Isla's reflection stared back at her in the tinted window. But for the first time, she wasn't sure she recognized the woman she saw. She had a choice to make. And for the first time in her life, she was ready to make it on her own terms. The following days were a blur of royal engagements, meetings, and preparations for her return to Akron. But beneath it all, something had shifted. She had felt what it was like to be free, to be herself. And she couldn't pretend it hadn't changed her. On the night before her departure, she stood before her father in his private study. King Zafar was a man of great presence. His mere gaze commanded respect. You've been distracted, Isla, he said, his voice low but firm. This past week I have seen it. Your mind is elsewhere. She met his gaze, standing tall. I want to continue playing music. A long silence stretched between them. Your duty is to your country, he said finally. And what if I could do both? She countered. The king's expression did not change, but there was something in his eyes, an acknowledgement that he had raised a daughter who would not be easily swayed. For the first time, she saw something else in him, too. Not just a king, but a father who, in his own way, wanted what was best for her, even if he didn't understand what that truly meant. Then prove it, he said at last. Show me that your music is more than a distraction. A challenge. One she was ready to accept. The next morning, as Isla prepared to leave for Akron, she found a note slipped beneath her door. Don't let them decide for you. You already know who you are. A slow smile spread across her lips. Sebastian Langley had been many things. A cynic, a businessman, an infuriatingly arrogant man. But he had also seen something in her that she had almost forgotten herself. And because of that, everything was about to change. For the first time in her life, Isla wasn't just a princess. She was something more. She was free. Life has a strange way of testing us. Sometimes, we meet people who judge us based on appearances, never bothering to look deeper. But the truth, The real truth always hides beneath the surface. Behind every ordinary face lies an extraordinary story waiting to be uncovered. Have you ever stopped to wonder, what if the person you just ignored, mocked, or underestimated was someone far greater than you could ever imagine? If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and share. Let's remind the world, kindness costs nothing, but it can change everything.